What's up, and welcome back to the greatest teacher of all time, where I, Quincy Dawson, interview teachers of color, tie their personalities, strategies, and philosophies on education. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and visit greatesteacherofalltime.com to help me support more great teachers like Dr. Bond. What's up, Steven?
Hey, how you doing? Good seeing you.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. Thank you so much for being here. I saw you doing some real cool stuff on Instagram with your history classes on your posts, and I feel I got to highlight you for it.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Mr. Dawson. That means a lot to me.
Yeah, of course you deserve it. So let's just start. So you are a social studies and used to be a history teacher, correct?
Yes, social studies and history, and I've taught every subject for history from about fourth grade on. I've taught the AP courses like AP History, U.S. History. I've taught AP Government and Politics. I've taught American History 1 and 2. I've taught Civics and Economics, War History. So I've also taught War History. So pretty much every history subject and social studies subject you think of, I've taught it, and it's truly been a blessing.
Man, that's so cool. And I guess when I think about history classes, I know I grew up in California, so our social studies talked about like California history and stuff like that. I know I took a US history, maybe world history classes, but wow, you teach like a whole wide range.
Yes, and I appreciate it because I taught in New York and then I lived in Florida for 10 years and I moved here about 10 years ago. So like you said, eighth grade, it is mostly North Carolina and American history. And so sixth, seventh grade, it's like War History Part 1 and then War History Part 2. So I've taught, thankfully, and covered a lot of the different history subjects and topics. So it's been an awesome experience and I still enjoy what I do.
Okay, that's great. That's great. And I want to get into that, right? So you mentioned that you taught in the New York, but also the southern states, right? And
Yes.
if you've been paying attention to the news, the South is doing a lot in terms of education. But when I get into that, I want to actually talk about one of your posts on Instagram. So
Hmm.
this one, you wrote a caption. It says, I've always believed and still believe that teaching history should be fun as well as tell a story. I'm so sick and tired of the restrictions and limitations some states are implementing in regards to teaching it. My belief is to keep it real and to keep it interactive. This is something that I will always do. So tell me about that. Maybe what motivated or inspired that post, but also some of the restrictions you're talking about.
Well, one of the things that got me like upset and frustrated was I did teach in Florida for a while, and I've been seeing the legislation about book banning, not wanting to teach history. People even had the audacity to say that slavery was beneficial, and when you get down to it, it had no benefits to the slave at all. If it benefited anyone, it benefited the slave owner, and so I was mad and just really, perturbed by, things been going on in some of the southern states. One thing to ban books, but now you're trying to rewrite history to say that, okay, slavery did happen, but it'll benefit you to try to, justify it and try to sugarcoat what really happened. And so, as much as history should be fun and interactive, which I do, we also have to mention the seriousness, the sadness, and some of the tragedies that occurred in our history. And we don't live up to it, it festers and it causes frustration and sometimes anger with people. And also it hides a guilt and shame that we have as a nation because there's never like a full forgiveness of it. And also it shows like people act like they're oblivious to what happened, that slavery was a foundation where, people got agriculture from it. Farms were built, cotton, tobacco, all these crops that was used to help benefit America was done by slaves where they did not get money for and they were treated subhuman. And so I want to mention it out why it was terrible. And so, we have to still discuss the atrocities that did happen in this nation. And also that a war occurred because of the same institution. Some call it a peculiar institution, but it was an institution that really morally declined America. And we know a civil war was fought for it. And afterwards, then they try to suppress groups of people, such as African Americans, afterwards. So they try to end slavery, and it was ended. They still try to suppress us and act like we still was in a slave state. And I just want to message it out that it doesn't need to happen, and not just Florida, but any other state that tries to ban books or ban the teaching of slavery should not be punished, should not be reprimanded, but the whole truth needs to be told as is, especially when I can trace my ancestors. to slavery, and is part of this horrible institution.
Yeah, and man, that's so interesting. And you're hitting all the points that I feel like our side keeps talking about. But I don't know, can you maybe for a second step into their shoes and think like, what is the rationale? Like, what is their reasoning behind basically changing history or like changing what is taught about history? Like, what is so harmful about knowing about slavery?
Well, I think what it does, I think it creates a sense of guilt for the ancestors who did own the slaves. I think that's what they're scared about. Second, I think there's always been in the mind of some people that African Americans have tried to get revenge for it. Even sometimes the topic of reparations are talked about and considered. But when you look at the different ethnic groups in America that have been taken advantage of in this franchise, there have been reparations. You look at the history when the Japanese Americans during World War II were put in internment camps in California, San Diego, San Francisco, all the way up to Seattle. And after World War II, when they came back, many of their homes were bombed and destroyed. And the U.S. government gave reparations. So sometimes where reparations scare people. But if you look at the what happened, Japanese Americans who did not betray the country, lived in our country at home, were put in internment camps, not bad the Nazi concentration camps, but they're still taken away from their homes and had their basic freedom taken away. And so we see that atrocity happen, and Supreme Court case justified it with Korematsu versus United States, 1944. That tells you a history of racism, not just with African Americans, but other minorities. And so it does create a guilt like, let's try to hide this part of history. That's like if you live in Germany and I have an uncle who lives there, you can say what you want, but you cannot hide what happened in the 1930s, 1940s with Nazi Germany, the concentration camps. And most Germans came to realization, if we want to heal from what happened, we have to confront it, the painful truth, and then you move forward. And in my opinion, America's never fully tried to address it, confront it. And that's why from that window, they want to keep the window closed, because then you're admitting that institution was done. It was done wrongfully, immorally, and there's never really been an apology for it. And sometimes I tell my students, many times apology will go a long way. It may not heal every wound, but just start the healing process. I know some states, even in my state, they were trying to ban the Ruby Bridges story. And, she celebrated birthday, but I think she's 67 years old. It's not that long ago. But why are they trying to ban the Ruby Bridges story? Because they said it's too painful or it's too sad. But when in reality, Ruby Bridges lived that tough life where she was bullied, harassed into when she was at the school. So why they banned the book? Because they don't want to open up that ugly chapter that's not been totally healed and confronted. So that's why I think the origin of it is. And what's going on in Florida? Florida was a state where there's a lot of racism. I lived there. You had riots in Rosewood. You had the racist incidents in Lake County in the 1930s and 40s. You had the Ocoee riots. So there's a history of violence and bloodshed in Florida. So if you open that story up, people say, wow, that happened 80, 90 years ago in a place that I've lived or been nearby. And so it brings up the wounds, but at the same time, you bring up the wounds, you can start the healing process. And I heard they're trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. It reminds me of like a friendship where like you and your friend have like a disagreement and then you just move forward still being friends, where like you never address the issue. It's always brewing in the back of your head. That's so interesting how you say that, and like it's causing America not to move forward from not addressing it. But
and I think this issue.
Now, yeah, and I was about to say, saying all this, do you think there's anything in history that maybe deserves to be restricted? Is there anything in history that fits that,
I emphatically say no. Now, what I do feel it needs to be age appropriate. Like I've been teaching middle school, I may not show everything that I would show in a high school, college class I taught, but I kind of, I don't say word down, but I tone it down because you don't need to see some violent images. So I agree in that sentiment. But at the same time, make age appropriate. But I think there's no era history that should not be taught. I agree. Everything should be taught. Like I said, know your audience. Obviously, like even with September 11th, when most school kids, they weren't there living, but at the same time, you gotta let them know about it. But like you see that they're a little traumatized by it, or if they're like just starting to cry, you want to tone down a little bit. But yes, you know about September 11th. So I think all history should be taught. Just know your audience, the age, and also know the mindset before you dive in too much. So that's just my take on it.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because it feels like with them trying to revise history or maybe ban books and things like that, they're not giving our students the chance to try to learn about it, right? Like they're automatically discrediting them, like, nah, you're not mature enough. Nah, you don't need to know this. And I feel like it's even more damaging.
Right.
Yeah.
And
And
it is.
yeah,
Because when
and
you get older, they'll say like, "Well, why didn't my teacher teach me this? Why did I never learn about Ruby Bridges?" And not just the black kids, but all the kids raised to say, "Well, I never learned this before. So why am I just hearing about this now when I'm 20 or 30 years old?" I have a lot of students who have told me, even on Instagram, they said, "Well, they said they didn't learn certain history till they got into college, or in the fact that 2% of male educators are black." And so, only 2%. And why is that? So many times they did not hear these things or learn these things. So it creates sometimes not even animosity, but a curiosity is why I never learned this before. I didn't know that race riots in my own state. So it creates a little bit of confusion too. Like, why was this withheld from me?
yeah, and that's so interesting that you bring that up because also you wrote a book that kind of exactly addresses that. Your book is called Unsung but Forever Remembered: The Man Who Invented the Automobile Turn Signal, David George Bond. So tell me about this and the revised history about your book.
Okay, now good. I'm glad you mentioned it. Now, my grandfather, David George Bond, was born in Bertie County, North Carolina. And I heard stories about it. When my parents were alive, they told me that he had a patent for the signal lights. And they wouldn't talk about it much, but it was like that, history that every now and then they would say, wow, we should be rich, or he got taken advantage of, or he never got the credit. So I did some diving and research on it, and I found his original patent, and he had a patent, officially patent with the US patent number, March 1st, 1927. And as I dug further, I also saw that the person who actually got credit for it, uh, when you Google search it, invented about 2 years after him. And so as I interviewed family members, talked to other family members, he did have the patent. He worked on it from the age of 16 at a boarding school in Martin County, North Carolina. He went through the proper procedures and did get patented. And due to time passing, he was able to endorse the invention like he would have. We was told that he did get threats from different supremacist groups. And long story short, the time the patent was running out, because a patent is like a license, like a driver's license. If you get renewed, you lose access to it. And that's what happened. He was trying to get the money to get renewed. He was never able to. But thankfully, he did have a patent for it, and I was able to find it. And so my book is just a little story about who he was, a humble man who had a genius mind. Did not go to school formally for years. He worked on a sharecropping farm. And recently I found through some of my family members the sharecropping farm where he did most of his work. It's now a cotton field. So the stories where, he worked in cotton farm, and his father, which was my great grandfather, worked in these farms basically for pennies a day. And so let you know the system of Jim Crow South I was back then. It was segregated in Bertie County, just like the rest of North Carolina. There were lynchings, there was intimidation, segregated schools. So the book briefly talks about my grandfather and why he should be in all the history books and why he should be relevant, because every moving vehicle has a signal light. And so that being said, if he invented this and has a patent to prove this, he should be in all the history books with some credit for it. And it's not about money. Like I told Peaches, I want him in the history books because he deserved that honor.
Yeah, and that's so cool. I think that's the big important part, right? Just honoring the history and the credit for what actually happened, right? Because yeah, it's man,
Yes.
yeah, and the way you say it's like that is a sad story being forgotten like that. But I'm so glad that you're keeping his memory alive. That's great.
Well, definitely. And what admired about my grandfather, he never talked about it much. From I was told from my dad, he never had too much animosity. He was a devoted father, husband, had 10 children, adopted one. So he just was a humble guy, worked, built his own house in 1956. So back then in Jim Crow South, to have your own house built, no, he was definitely blessed. but obviously, could have, would have, should have been more of a legacy that he should have had. And like I said, more than anything, I just want him to get the recognition and accolades that he deserved and should have had when he was alive.
Yeah, man. And that's great. That's great. I love that you're doing that. I want to talk about a little more about that Instagram post, but before we do that, let's take a quick pause to hear an ad from Teachers of Color Matter.
Friend, we need to talk. As a teacher of color with a social justice mindset, I know if I give big to my students, I also need to replenish big to myself. My Clap for Yourself 5-minute reflection journal is perfect. This journal was designed for teachers of color, so it takes my experiences in the classroom to heart. And friend, this journal has everything. It helps me address feelings of overwhelm, anxiety, and self-doubt. I can either fill out a template on the right side or process a larger issue on the left. The templates bring more intention and success into my day, and I can use the adult coloring moments when I'm calling a parent or during a staff meeting. And Dr. Michelle has written letters to me throughout the book. It's almost as if she's reading my mind. The inspirational quotes remind me that I'm part of a legacy. Representation matters, and I do make an impact. What does your morning routine look like?
All right, welcome back. So Stephen, I want to get back into that post you made a while ago, but you also said that it's really important to make history fun and accessible. I know, kind of like physics, the stereotype, when you hear the word, it just makes you want to fall asleep. So how do you fight that with your history classes?
Good question. History, like I told people, can be one of the most interesting stories in class you can have, or if you don't do right, can be one of the most boringest class that you dread to go to. And I always felt like history, in the latter, is one of the most interesting, intriguing, compelling subjects. Because you can tie in all the other disciplines. You can tie in the science into history, the mathematics, the ELA, the reading part. And so when it's done properly, it's a fun class. I make different things to make it interesting. I dress up sometimes. I dress up as an Egyptian pharaoh, and the students loved it, the parents loved it. I put it on the post. My school put it on the post. And so what we saw was that the Egyptians were royal in stature, that they were advanced civilization. And so you dress up like that, what it does, it gives a good segue for the students to be interested first, and it piques their interest. And so just last week, I dressed up as King Henry VIII, from the Tudor dynasty, so I could switch it up. And the students just fascinated by it. I had a crown on my head, had on a red cape, and they loved it. So piquing the interest is first. Making the topic is fun, where we'll listen to music. It's not just reading notes and boring stuff, the monotony, but listening to facts, reading the facts, but also making it curious to the people. What did the Egyptians invent? Okay, they had on toothpaste, had on toothbrushes, had razors, had haircuts. It can tie into today, like our haircuts are so important, especially for people of color. Your haircut, your goatee, your trim is so important no matter how old you get. And so you tie those things interconnected. Talk about the Tudor dynasty and King Henry VIII, and talk about the family situations. Like I told my class, it would have made for a great reality show. We're talking about the Kardashians, we're talking about the different reality shows, but think about the Tudor dynasty with King Henry VIII, divorcing these women and fights and fight within the church and then British society. You're looking like this could be one messy but intriguing reality show. And so when you tie history in like that, they're like, oh wow, it's pretty cool. It's pretty fun. And so in the serious subjects, you want to be serious about it, but that it compels the interest of the person, no matter what race. And I always felt like when you teach history the right way, everybody likes it, everyone gets involved. Like they'll say, have Black History Month, have Hispanic History Month. But I always felt when history is taught properly, it covers all the angles, all the people, male and female, all the races. You don't have to relegate a Black History Month, because in other words, it should be taught the whole year. What the Europeans did should be taught the whole year. So if you talk about the Middle Ages in Europe, mention about Mali and Timbuktu, mention Musa, mention everybody. And guys, we talking about the different military leaders, because I have one group that loves military history. We're talking about Joseph Stalin, the Russians. We're talking about Hitler and the Germans. And I mentioned about Shaka Zulu of Southern Africa, how he's a military strategist and one of the most intriguing and compelling minds in war history. A lot of things we do when we surround the enemy and stuff, we learn from him. So when you tie it in the right way, you mention everybody by race, male and female. I would tell my class how Joseph Stalin in World War II had 2 million women fighting for him against the Nazis. And the women were snipers. They were shooting the Nazis like crazy. And someone said women can be very precise and accurate and meticulous and organized. He having snipers. And so it ties in for the females in class. Okay, we're not forgotten. So we mentioned the females. We talk about sports. We talk about Coco Gauff and the history she made. It becomes one big story that's more compelling, more interesting, and entertaining.
Yeah, I love that. I also really like how you mentioned like it's the greatest reality TV show ever, right? Because when you see things like
Yes,
when you see things that happen on like the Kardashians or like the Housewives or whatever Blueface and Krishan are doing, it inspires all these unproductive think pieces online, right? With you and your
right.
talking about like real meaningful history, you get your students to actually do these think pieces, right?
Exactly. Yes. And they get involved. And so, like, I'll have them say, go up to the principal and what was I dressed as? A pharaoh or Pharaoh's Egyptian leader. Or I just dress up and I say, I'm a tutor. Which tutor am I? And they say, oh, King Henry VIII. Who was his dad? Oh, King Henry VII. What were some of his daughters? Queen Elizabeth the First. How's that tie in? She was queen and led England during their empire. So we tied in like that. They become part of it, doing role plays and skits, having kids sing songs that were for that time. I'm a big fan and a friend of Chuck D from Public Enemy. And so we teach about civil rights movement. We mentioned the importance of Chuck D. He had this song Fight the Power, which inspired me to want to be a history teacher. So he mentioned about the things racism going on. And I remember during the George Floyd murder, they made a remix of Fight the Power 2020. And someone said the same issues that Public Enemy talked about in 1989 when the song was written are some of the same issues 31 years later. And so we see how it ties in. It also lets us know that a lot of things are unresolved. So we don't talk about slavery enough. But now the issues of racism is still rising up because they had not been truly confronted. They had not truly been addressed. So talking about racial profiling. We're also talking about gerrymandering, even with voting, where they're trying to do voting suppression.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's so powerful that you say that. And I think that kind of just makes it even more valuable and really inspires students to do more, you know? And speaking of inspiring, you actually got a new inspiring role. You're now the vice president for North Carolina Councils for Social Studies. Is that true?
Yes, I was elected March of this year, and I was so excited about it. I was elected as a board member the year before, and so they had an opening for vice president. And the first one was not going to run, and a few of my friends and colleagues they said, "Well, Steve, you should run." And I said, "You know what? I'm gonna take your advice and run." And I did win the election, and I was so happy about it. Also, when they have the council, they each year we have a big social studies meeting, and so it's usually March of the year. Next year is going to be in February, and so when we have a convention, I've done some workshops and professional developments. Like the last couple of years, I've done workshops on tying in social emotional learning with social studies because of all the subject. Social studies is a great avenue in which you could teach social emotional learning, which is very important, especially during this time.
Especially, yeah, because a lot of social studies and history is trying to understand why these things are happening, right? So if you're able to
Right.
connect with these historians on a social emotional level, then you know way more about what's going on, huh?
Exactly, you do. And one of the things I told my students recently, and you can do a lot of comparison with America, with not America with Jim Crow and the Nazis. Because a lot of the ideas that the Nazis came up with, they got from Jim Crow South with de facto segregation. Now we know the Germans took it on a higher level, but a lot of their roots of it was from Jim Crow South. And one of the things that the Germans did at the end of World War II when they went when Buchenwald, when the concentration camp was finally delivered and finally captured and people released, they made the German people walk by the camp and see the atrocities that were done. And I was so important because there were people that denied it, said it didn't happen, said, oh, just a few Jewish prisoners, maybe a few people. And so when the German people had a chance to see the people in that Buchenwald prison camp and they started crying, they realized, okay, all this time we were blinded to the ignorance and the murdering that was going on. And it set a tone for them. And so that's why in America, sometimes we try to hide those things because yes, we didn't have a Holocaust, but that slave trading that was done, that slavery that was done, the atrocity, the lynchings is very similar. And so people did not have a chance to see what happened. So when you are hidden from history and did not know there were lynchings, that you know that's how slavery was and how important it was, that pretty much the Civil War was fought over it, they don't see how damaging it was to us as a country and to a moral fiber. So when the Germans saw the Buchenwald, it was like the hand around the wall saying, wow, we really were awful. And that's why, in my view, they try to hide these things. They don't want to mention, oh, how Ruby Bridge was treated, or the Little Rock Nine, how they were beaten and harassed on different days. Melba Patillo Beals, when she wrote her book with the Little Rock Nine, Warriors Don't Cry, they're trying to ban that book because the horrific things where she almost got raped at the school, got called the N-word. They said, well, this is too painful to be mentioned in class. Why? Because it happened in America. But you can discuss the Holocaust, which was an atrocity. You can discuss other things. So that hiding of the truth is never a good thing.
Yeah, man, so much. And I can really hear like the passion for all this. But being the VP for North Carolina Council for Social Studies, what type of changes can you make or do you want to make in education?
Well, good question. One of the things that we've been, adamant about is about the book bank situation. And one of the things that really was an issue, they tried to stir up a House bill, and it was called House Bill 187. And in this House bill, what they were trying to say is that history can be taught in a certain way. Like one of the things it mentions that you cannot talk, now obviously not passed, but it talked about, well, you can't talk about a certain group of people who are oppressed in this country, trying to silence or not talk about racism and how it was a systemic. But here's the thing, if racism was systemic, where there were codes, where there were laws, where the fact of segregation is systemic. And so when you try to implement a House bill like this, what message are you sending? And it was in vague terms where it's trying to make teachers nervous to say like, well, I can't teach about racism because I don't want to lose my job. But when you're clearly saying that you cannot say a people in our country were oppressed, that's lies. Because it's not just African Americans. The Japanese Americans during World War II, the Native Americans who had land stolen and were massacred, the Polish Americans, what they went through, Irish Americans, bring about a plethora of people who were treated awful, and it was oppression. So we, together mentioned that we do not want this House bill to pass. And one thing we're working on, and we have, when we have a convention, we have many workshop professional developments. So history is taught in a more productive way, that we're not going to have like one case a teacher try to do a role play of where kids would go into concentration camp and be burned. We don't need that to be history to be taught like that. So in the professional development, the teaching strategy on how to teach certain topics, because some don't know, but some just are like, you have to say, okay, show more wisdom than to do a role play of that. Like when we do role play in social studies, it's sometimes going to be comical, but we're not going to try to demean a student or demean a race to say, oh yeah, you're a slave today, you're going to have to pick cotton. Those are things we want to try to stop from happening and possibly eliminate. And so the purpose of the council is to make sure, social studies is continue to be a relevant topic, but also make sure it is taught in a way that is respectful and understanding and just, right, where you don't feel like, okay, I feel disrespected as a group of people. Or my son went home and said, yes, Miss So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so told me to be a slave, and I come picking cotton, or I come getting lynched. That we don't need in social study curriculum.
Yeah, I am 100% with you. Yeah, with sensitive and big, heavy topics like that, they really do need to be taught very delicately. Man, thank you so much for
Definitely.
this, Stephen, Mr. Bond, or Dr. Bond. All your thoughts on the education system, teaching social studies, being the VP for North Carolina's council, they're all part of the reasons why I think you might be one of the greatest teachers of all time. And thanks to Teachers of Color Matter, Victorious RED Restoration, and a couple of anonymous donors, I'd actually like to give you this $150 prepaid gift card to use for you or your students or anything you choose. And thank you to everyone else for watching The Greatest Teacher of All Time, where I, Quincy Dawson, interview teachers of color, tie their personalities, strategies, and philosophies on education. Please make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. And if you really liked it, leave a comment for me and Dr. Bond to see. Also, if you are the greatest teacher of all time, or if you think you know the greatest teacher of all time, let me know. Go to greatesteacherofalltime.com and click on Submit a Teacher. Hope to see you soon.